Hello friends, and you explorers chasing that uniquely refreshing aroma. Today, we're focusing on the fascinating history of coffee, a journey that began when a shepherd's attention was caught on the wild plateaus of Ethiopia and spread from palaces to the streets. We'll witness the story of this fruit, which spans from Yemen's mysterious ports to Istanbul's intellectual coffee houses and lies at the heart of social revolutions. I'm curious, what's your favorite coffee? It's always a pleasure to read your comments. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where mountains rise above 8,000 feet and mist clings to ancient forests, a plant grew wild that would eventually captivate the entire world. This is where the story of coffee begins. Not in a cafe in Paris or plantation in Brazil, but in the rugged terrain of East Africa, where red berries grew on trees that nobody yet understood could change human history. The most famous story of coffee's discovery is the legend of Kaldi, an Ethiopian goat herder. According to this tale, which was first written down centuries after it supposedly happened, Kaldi noticed his goats behaving strangely. They were dancing, full of unusual energy, refusing to sleep at night. Curious about what had transformed his normally calm animals into these spirited creatures, Kaldi observed them more carefully. He watched as they ate the bright red berries from a particular tree. When he tried the berries himself, he felt the same surge of energy and alertness. These berries, the legend continues that Kaldi brought these berries to a local monastery where a monk, skeptical of this strange discovery, threw them into the fire, declaring them the devil's work. But as the berries roasted in the flames, they released an aroma so compelling that the monks reconsidered. They rescued the roasted beans from the fire, ground them up, and mixed them with water, creating what might have been the world's first cup of coffee. Greater than. The Epistle to the Hebrews. It is a beautiful story. It has been told and retold for generations. But here is what we need to understand. This is almost certainly a legend, not historical fact. The tale of Kaldi first appears in written form in 1667, recorded by a Lebanese Maronite monk named Antoine Niren. That is, centuries after coffee had already spread across the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. No contemporary Ethiopian sources mention Kaldi or his dancing goats, yet legends often contain kernels of truth. And this one tells us something important. Coffee was discovered in Ethiopia, and its discovery was likely accidental, observed first in animals before humans understood its properties. What we know for certain is this coffee arabica, the species that accounts for roughly 60% of the world's coffee today, is native to the highlands of Ethiopia. It grew wild in the forests there for thousands of years before humans paid it any particular attention. The plant thrived in the specific conditions of the Ethiopian highlands. High altitude, rich volcanic soil, the right balance of sun and shade, distinct wet and dry seasons. These factors created an environment where coffee could flourish naturally. The indigenous peoples of Ethiopia, particularly the Oromo people, had their own relationship with coffee that predates any written records. The Oromo did not brew coffee as we know it. Instead, they mixed the crushed coffee cherries with animal fat, creating dense energy balls. Warriors and travelers would carry these provisions on long journeys with the strength of the greater than combination of fat and caffeine provided sustained energy, a practical fuel for survival in challenging terrain. Other early Ethiopian uses for coffee were equally practical and equally far from the beverage we recognize today. People chewed the raw coffee cherries, eating both the fruit and the bean inside. The effect was mild compared to brewed coffee, but noticeable enough that the plant gained a reputation as something special. In some regions, people made a weak tea from the coffee leaves, rather than the cherries themselves. Each of these methods represented humans learning through trial and error how to harness the stimulating properties of this wild plant. The Ethiopian highlands were not a unified kingdom during these early centuries. They were home to various peoples, cultures, and belief systems, each interacting with the coffee plant in their own ways. The region's mountainous geography meant communities were often isolated from one another, allowing different traditions to develop independently. Some used coffee in religious ceremonies. Others saw it purely as a practical tool. Still, others may have ignored it entirely, focusing on the many other plants the fertile highlands provided. We cannot pinpoint exactly when Ethiopians first began using coffee with intention rather than accident. Archaeological evidence for organic materials like coffee beans rarely survives centuries in tropical climates. Written records from this period are scarce, and those that exist focus on kingdoms, wars, and trade, not the everyday uses of plants. What we can say with confidence is that by the time coffee appears in the historical record of other regions, it was already well established in Ethiopian culture. The coffee plant itself holds clues to this long relationship. Coffee Arabica has remarkable genetic diversity in Ethiopia compared to anywhere else in the world. When plants are cultivated elsewhere, they represent just a tiny fraction of the genetic varieties found in Ethiopian forests. This diversity is the signature of a plant that evolved and thrived in one place for a very long time. Varieties greater than Ethiopia is not just where humans found coffee. It is where coffee became coffee through countless generations of natural selection in a unique environment. The journey from Ethiopia to Yemen was not far in terms of pure distance. The Red Sea is narrow at certain points, barely more than 200 meters across. But that crossing represented an enormous leap in coffee's history. What had been a wild plant used casually by various Ethiopian communities was about to become something entirely different. They are greater than a deliberately cultivated crop with religious significance, sophisticated preparation methods, and economic value that would soon attract the attention of the world. We do not know precisely when coffee first arrived in Yemen, but most historians place it sometime in the 15th century, probably in the early to middle part of that century. The most commonly cited figure in this transfer is a Sufi mystic named Sheikh Ali ibn Umar al-Shadili. Though, like many historical figures from this period, the details of his life are mixed with legend. According to tradition, Shadili encountered coffee during his travels or exile in Ethiopia and recognized its potential for spiritual practice. Keep the pace steady. Whether this specific story is accurate matters less than what it represents. Coffee came to Yemen through contact with Ethiopia, likely via traders, travelers, or religious figures who moved between these regions. What made Yemen different from Ethiopia was not just that coffee arrived there, but what the Yemens did with it. They began to cultivate it deliberately. Instead of harvesting from wild trees scattered through forests, Yemen farmers planted coffee and organized terraces on the slopes of their mountains. The terraced agriculture of Yemen was already sophisticated. Farmers had long grown khat and other crops on steep hillsides, managing water carefully in a region where rain was precious. They applied this expertise to coffee. The climate of Yemen's mountains, particularly in regions like the Western Highlands, proved remarkably suitable for coffee. The terraces sat at high elevations anywhere from 3,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level. Cool nights and warm days, limited but sufficient rainfall, rich volcanic soil. In many ways, these conditions echoed the Ethiopian highlands where coffee originated. The plant adapted well to its new home, and Yemen farmers learned through experimentation which locations and techniques produced the best results. But cultivation alone does not explain coffee's transformation in Yemen. What truly changed everything was the Sufi mystics and their use of coffee for religious practice. Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam, emphasizing direct personal experience of the divine through practices like dhikr, repetitive prayer and meditation often performed at night. These sessions could last for hours, and maintaining alertness and focus was essential. Coffee provided exactly what the Sufis needed. The mystics began drinking coffee before and during their nighttime prayers and ceremonies. The stimulant effect kept them awake and mentally sharp. More than that, practitioners reported that coffee helped them achieve states of heightened spiritual awareness. Whether this was purely the result of caffeine, or whether the ritual of preparation and consumption played a psychological role, coffee became integrated into Sufi religious practice. In their monasteries and lodges called zoas, Sufis developed increasingly refined methods for preparing coffee. This is where the brewing methods we recognize today began to take shape. The Yemens discovered that roasting the beans before brewing them produced a far more potent and flavorful drink than simply boiling raw beans or dried cherries. They experimented with different roasting times and temperatures using clay pots over open flames. The beans would crackle and darken, releasing oils and aromas. Once cooled, the roasted beans were ground, first using mortar and pestle, later with more sophisticated grinders. The ground coffee was then boiled with water, sometimes repeatedly, to extract maximum flavor and caffeine. The resulting drink was strong, bitter, and energizing, quite different from the mild effects of chewing raw coffee cherries. This method of preparation, roasting, and brewing represented a technological breakthrough. It unlocked coffee's full potential as a stimulant and transformed it into something that could be shared, standardized, and eventually commercialized. As coffee's reputation spread within Yemen, it moved beyond the Sufi lodges into broader society. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, coffee was being consumed not just by mystics, but by scholars, merchants, and eventually ordinary people. The drink acquired a name in Arabic provided by this. The word originally referred to wine, and its application to coffee is telling. Coffee was seen as an intoxicant of sorts, greater than something that altered consciousness, even if in a very different way than alcohol. Greater than. The port city of Mocha, located on Yemen's Red Sea coast, became central to coffee's expanding story. Coffee from the highlands. Mocha was already an important trading center, a place where goods from the interior of Yemen met ships from across the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and beyond. Warehouses await are greater than as coffee production in the Yemeni highlands increased. Greater than Mocha became the primary export point. Coffee grown on the terrace slopes was carried by caravan down to Mocha's warehouses, where merchants prepared it for shipment to Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Constantinople. The name Mocha became synonymous with Yemen coffee. So much so that for centuries, people referred to coffee itself as mocha. This was not a flavor or a style. It was simply where the coffee came from. Mocha was the gateway through which coffee began its journey to the rest of the world. The port's prominence made Yemen wealthy and gave Yemen authorities a strong incentive to protect their monopoly on coffee production. Monopoly at all cost. The Yemens understood they had something valuable. They closely guarded their coffee cultivation methods and more importantly, the coffee plants themselves. Seeds were not supposed to leave Yemen. The authorities wanted to ensure that anyone who wanted coffee had to buy it from Yemen merchants through Mocha is absurd. This monopoly would last for more than a century, making Yemen rich and keeping coffee relatively rare and expensive in other regions. When coffee reached the cities of the Ottoman Empire in the early 16th century, it entered a world of enormous sophistication, power, and cultural complexity. The Ottoman Empire at this time was at its height, a vast territory stretching from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, from the edges of the Sahara to the Crimean Peninsula. I offered 20 gold. Its cities were cosmopolitan centers where trade, scholarship, art, and politics converged. And it was in these urban spaces that coffee would become something it had never been before. Invigorating discovery, the centerpiece of a revolutionary new social institution. The first Ottoman cities to embrace coffee were those closest to its source. Mecca, the holy city of Islam, greater than received coffee early through its connections with Yemen. Pilgrims and merchants brought it into the city, and its use spread quickly among scholars and religious students, who appreciated its ability to keep them alert during long hours of study and prayer. We must persevere in our studies. From Mecca, coffee traveled to Cairo, the intellectual and commercial heart of the southern Ottoman territories. Cairo in the early 1500s was a city of perhaps 400,000 people filled with mosques, madrasas, bazaars, and palaces. Here, coffee found an eager audience. But it was in Constantinople, today's Istanbul, where coffee would truly transform into a cultural phenomenon. The Ottoman capital was the empire's beating heart, home to the Sultan and his court, to administrators and soldiers, to merchants from across 3 continents, to artisans and laborers speaking dozens of languages. Greater than. When coffee arrived in Constantinople around 1555, it arrived in a city ready for something new. The crucial innovation was the coffee house itself. Have you ever tasted cafe cane in Turkish? These establishments began appearing in Constantinople in the 1550s and 1560s. The earliest coffee houses were opened by 2 men, both from Syria, a man named Hakim from Aleppo, and another named Shams from Damascus. They recognized an opportunity. Coffee was still novel enough to attract curiosity, but established enough to have a reputation. From the heavens, they set up shops where people could come to drink this exotic beverage prepared by skilled hands. These first coffee houses were simple places, but they offered something the city lacked greater than a public space designed specifically for conversation and leisure. Ottoman society already had mosques for prayer, baths for cleaning and socializing, and bazaars for commerce. This blend is super. But coffee houses created a new category, a place where men could gather without a specific purpose beyond enjoying themselves and each other's company. You paid a small fee, received a cup of strong, bitter coffee, and could sit for hours. The coffee house concept spread through Constantinople with remarkable speed. Within a few years, dozens of establishments had opened across the city. Each developed its own character and clientele. Some attracted scholars and poets. Others became gathering places for merchants discussing business. Still others drew students, artisans or soldiers. The coffee houses near the Grand Bazaar filled with traders. Those near the universities attracted intellectuals. The diversity of the city reflected itself in the diversity of its coffee houses. What made these establishments revolutionary was what happened inside them. People played chess and backgammon. Poets recited verses. Musicians performed. Storytellers captivated audiences with tales from the Arabian Nights or Persian epics. Debates erupted about theology, politics, philosophy, and current events. News traveled through coffee houses faster than through any other channel. Yes, greater than if you wanted to know what was happening in the city or the empire. You went to a coffee house and listened. I may never leave. The architecture and atmosphere of these spaces encouraged interaction. Most coffee houses featured low benches or cushions arranged around the walls, creating an intimate setting where conversation flowed easily. Greater than. The coffee itself, strong and stimulating, kept minds sharp and tongues loose. Unlike alcohol, which Ottoman Islamic law prohibited in public, coffee enhanced, rather than dulled mental faculties. The truest wisdom is found. Greater than. You could drink coffee and still maintain your dignity, your judgment, and your ability to engage in serious discussion. This social mixing troubled Ottoman authorities from the beginning. In coffee houses, a scholar might sit next to a shopkeeper, a military officer beside a craftsman. Taxes, greater than the traditional hierarchies of Ottoman society, softened in these spaces. People spoke more freely than they did in mosques or in the presence of officials. Criticism of the government circulated. Satirical poems mocking powerful figures were recited and applauded. For a regime that valued order and control, coffee houses represented something potentially dangerous. Religious authorities also viewed coffee houses with suspicion. Some Muslim scholars argued that coffee itself was haram, forbidden, drawing parallels to wine. If the Quran prohibited intoxicants and coffee intoxicated the mind, should it not also be forbidden? The fact that coffee was roasted over fire until black lead. Some to associate it with the charring practices forbidden in certain Islamic traditions. These arguments were never universally accepted, but they provided ammunition for those who wanted to suppress coffeehouse culture. The first major attempt to ban coffee in the Ottoman Empire came in Mecca in 1511, before coffee houses had even emerged in Constantinople. The governor Beg declared coffee forbidden and ordered the coffee houses closed. His motivations appear to have been both religious and political. He claimed coffee violated Islamic law, but he was also concerned about the political discussions happening in these establishments. However, the ban proved impossible to enforce and was eventually overturned by authorities in Cairo. More significant was the attempt by Sultan Murad III to suppress coffee houses in Constantinople in 1580. Murad was a conservative ruler concerned about public morality and social order. He viewed coffee houses as dens of idleness and sedition where men wasted time and spoke too freely. He issued decrees ordering them closed. Authorities destroyed coffee beans and raided establishments. Some coffeehouse owners were reportedly punished severely, but the Sultan faced an impossible task. Coffeehouses had become too integral to Constantinople's social fabric. When authorities closed them, they simply reopened elsewhere or operated clandestinely. The demand was overwhelming and the economic incentives too strong. Coffeehouse owners bribed officials. Customers protested. The coffeehouses represented too much employment, too much tax revenue, and too much public satisfaction to be eliminated entirely. Eventually, enforcement weakened, and the establishments returned. The boundary between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe was not a simple line on a map. It was a frontier of conflict and commerce, warfare and exchange. suspicion, and fascination. Under imperial, for centuries, these two civilizations had clashed militarily while simultaneously trading with each other. Venice, the great maritime republic, stood at the center of this complex relationship. Venetian merchants had maintained commercial connections with Ottoman territories even during times of war. And it was through these trading networks that coffee would make its first appearance in Europe. Venice in the late 1500s was one of Europe's wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities. Its merchant fleets dominated Mediterranean trade, bringing spices from the East, silk from Persia, and countless other goods to European markets. Venetian merchants lived in Ottoman cities, learned Turkish and Arabic, and observed Ottoman customs firsthand. They drank coffee in Constantinople and Damascus, EXPERIENCED, coffeehouse culture, and recognized a potential new commodity when they encountered it. The exact date when coffee first arrived in Venice is disputed, but most historians place it in the 1570s or 1580s. Initially, it came in small quantities, samples brought back by individual merchants rather than commercial shipments. These early arrivals were curiosities, exotic items from the East to be shared with fellow merchants or offered to wealthy patrons. The Venetians called it the Turkish drink, or simply described it as a beverage popular among Muslims. For the first Europeans who tasted it, coffee was startling. The flavor was intensely bitter, unlike anything in European cuisine. The appearance was dark and murky. The effect was undeniable but strange. A stimulation that sharpened the mind without the warmth and euphoria of wine or the drowsiness of beer. Europeans had no context for understanding coffee. Their beverages were either water, wine, beer, or milk. Hot drinks were limited to broths and medicinal teas. Coffee fit none of these categories. More troubling than its unfamiliar taste was its association with Islam. Coffee came from Muslim lands. It was the drink of Turkish coffeehouses, of Arab scholars, of the same Ottomans who threatened Christian Europe militarily. In an era when religious identity defined civilization itself, when Europeans viewed Muslims as enemies of Christendom, embracing a Muslim beverage seemed almost like betrayal. Some Christians called coffee the bitter invention of Satan, claiming the devil had created it to substitute for the wine that Christian ritual and culture celebrated Italy. Greater than. This religious anxiety about coffee was not merely superstition. It reflected genuine theological concerns. Wine held sacred significance in Christianity. Jesus had transformed water into wine at Cana. The Eucharist used wine as the blood of Christ. Wine appeared throughout the Bible as a blessing from God. If Muslims, who could not drink wine, had turned to coffee instead, was coffee not implicitly opposed to Christian values? The logic was flawed, but in the heated religious atmosphere of the late 1600s, such arguments carried weight. The controversy escalated as coffee became more available in Italy. By the 1590s, coffee was arriving in Venice in larger quantities. No longer just a curiosity, but an actual trade good. Some merchants began selling it, and some Italians began drinking it regularly. This growing popularity alarmed religious authorities. Christian clergy debated whether the faithful should be permitted to consume this Muslim drink. Some argued for an outright ban. Others were less certain, but still deeply suspicious. The debate eventually reached Rome and the attention of Pope Clement VI, who served as pontiff from 1592 until 6005. The exact circumstances of what happened next have been embellished over the centuries, but the essential story appears to be true. Clement's advisors brought the coffee question before him, urging him to condemn the beverage as satanic and forbid Christians from drinking it. The drink was too delicious, they argued, to have been intended for Christians. Satan had given it to Muslims to replace the wine denied them. Clement, however, was curious rather than immediately judgmental. He asked to taste the coffee himself before making a decision. Servants prepared it according to the Ottoman method, roasted, ground, and brewed into a strong hot drink. "What is this?" The Pope brought the cup to his lips and drank. According to the popular telling of this story, after tasting it, Clement declared that the beverage was indeed delicious, and that it would be a pity to let only Muslims enjoy it. Precisely. He is said to have proclaimed something to the effect of greater than this. Satan's drink is so good we should cheat the devil by baptizing it and making it a Christian beverage. Greater than. Whether Clement actually said these exact words, we cannot know. The story has been retold so many times that separating truth from legend is impossible. But what matters historically is the result. Pope Clement VI did not condemn coffee by not banning it, by reportedly blessing it instead. He removed the religious barrier to coffee's acceptance in Christian Europe. Prove it. If the Pope himself approved, greater than how could ordinary Christians object? This papal acceptance was crucial for coffee's European future. In an age when the Church's authority shaped every aspect of life, when questions of sin and salvation dominated public discourse, the Pope's blessing gave coffee legitimacy. It transformed coffee from a suspicious foreign beverage into something Christians could consume without endangering their souls. Merchants no longer had to worry that selling coffee might be considered promoting infidelity. Customers could drink it without fear of spiritual contamination. The practical effect was immediate. Coffee imports into Venice increased. More merchants entered the trade. Apothecaries began selling coffee beans and ground coffee as a medicinal substance. It was thought to aid digestion, cure headaches, and improve alertness, which was actually accurate regarding the last claim. The Italian medical community debated coffee's properties using the humoral theory of medicine that dominated European medical thinking. Some physicians declared it hot and dry, others cold and dry, but most agreed it had therapeutic value. From Venice, coffee spread to other Italian cities. Rome developed its own coffee trade. Florence, Genoa, and Milan followed. But Italy remained just the entry point. Coffee merchants looked north to the wealthy cities of Germany, France, and the Low Countries. They looked west to Spain and Portugal, and they looked across the English Channel to London. Each of these places would receive coffee with its own mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and enthusiasm. England in the middle of the 17th century was a society in turmoil. The Civil War had ended with King Charles I executed in 1649. The monarchy was abolished. Oliver Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector of a commonwealth that nobody quite understood. Religious tensions divided communities. Political uncertainty dominated every conversation. Into this unstable, intellectually charged environment came coffee. And it arrived at precisely the right moment to become something extraordinary. The first English coffee house opened not in London, but in Oxford, the university city where England's intellectual elite gathered. In 1650, a Lebanese Jewish merchant named Jacob opened a coffee house in Oxford, catering to the university community. Students and scholars, already familiar with coffee from their studies of Ottoman culture, or travels in the Mediterranean embraced this establishment. They gathered there to debate the great questions of the day: politics, religion, natural philosophy, mathematics. Hurry, friends. The Oxford Coffee House became an extension of the university itself, an informal classroom where ideas circulated as freely as the coffee. 2 years later, in 1652, greater than coffee reached London. A merchant named Daniel Edwards had travelled extensively in Ottoman territories and developed a taste for coffee. The passion. When he returned to London, he brought with him a servant named Paschal Ross, an Armenian or Greek who knew how to prepare coffee properly. Edwards introduced coffee to his friends and business associates, serving it at his home. The demand was such that Ross suggested opening a public establishment. Edwards agreed, setting up rows in a small shop in St. Michael's Alley, Cornhill, in the heart of London's commercial district. Pasqua Ross's coffee house was London's first, and its success was immediate. Ross advertised coffee's benefits in a broadside, a printed advertisement that was one of the first of its kind in England. He claimed coffee aided digestion, prevented drowsiness, helped with coughs, prevented miscarriages, and cured numerous other ailments. Not all of these claims were accurate, but the promise of health benefits, combined with the genuine stimulant effect, made coffee attractive to Londoners looking for something new. Within a few years, coffee houses multiplied across London. By 1660, the city had dozens of them. By 1680, there were hundreds. Each neighborhood developed its own coffeehouse culture. Near the Royal Exchange, merchants gathered to discuss trade and finance. Near the Inns of Court, lawyers debated legal matters. In neighborhoods frequented by writers and artists, coffee houses became literary salons. The diversity of London society expressed itself through the diversity of its coffee houses. The English coffee house differed from its Ottoman predecessor in important ways. English establishments were more overtly commercial and less focused on entertainment. There were no musicians performing, no elaborate storytelling traditions. Instead, the focus was on conversation, business, and information exchange. Customers could read newspapers, a relatively new invention which coffeehouse proprietors provided. Pamphlets, political tracts, and controversial writings circulated from table to table. The coffeehouse became London's informal mail system, message board, and news service. People called them penny universities because for the price of a penny, the cost of admission plus coffee, you could sit for hours and educate yourself by listening to the conversations around you. A young man with ambition but no formal education could learn about politics from politicians, business from merchants, science from natural philosophers simply by frequenting the right coffee houses. This was revolutionary. Knowledge had always been guarded by institutions, universities, guilds, churches. Coffee houses democratized it. Specific coffee houses became associated with specific fields or interests. Because of all greater than Jonathan's Coffee House, opened in 1680 on Exchange Alley, greater than, became the gathering place for stock traders. Greater than. Merchants would meet there to buy and sell shares in trading. Ventures to speculate on commodity prices, to arrange insurance for ships. Greater than. The trading that happened at Jonathan's eventually formalized into what would become the London Stock Exchange. A cup of coffee had created the institutional foundation for modern finance. Even more significant was Edward Lloyd's Coffee House. Opened around 1687 on Tower Street, later moving to Lombard Street. Lloyd catered specifically to maritime merchants, ship captains, and traders involved in overseas commerce. He began collecting and distributing information about ship movements, cargo, and maritime conditions. Customers could learn which ships had arrived safely, which had been lost, which cargoes were available for purchase. This information was so valuable that Lloyd's Coffee House became the center of London's maritime trade. More importantly, merchants began using Lloyd's to arrange insurance for their ships and cargoes. They would meet there to assess risks and agree on premiums. This informal practice evolved into organized insurance underwriting. Individual underwriters would sign their names under the terms of an insurance contract, literally underwriting it. Lloyd's Coffee House became Lloyd's of London, the insurance market that still exists today as one of the world's most important financial institutions. Coffee had created modern insurance. The English government viewed coffee houses with the same suspicion Ottoman authorities had shown. These establishments were difficult to control. People spoke freely, often critically, about those in power. Political organizing happened in coffee houses. Conspiracies were allegedly hatched there. I tell you, greater than during the Restoration when Charles II reclaimed the throne in 1660s. The new government worried that coffee houses provided meeting places for Republicans, denters and radicals. In 1675, Charles II issued a proclamation attempting to suppress coffee houses. He declared they were centers of sedition and ordered them closed. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Merchants protested that coffee houses were essential to their business. The public was outraged. The economic disruption was too severe. Within 11 days, the king backed down. He withdrew the proclamation, though he instituted requirements that coffee housekeepers prevent seditious talk and prohibited certain publications. Like the Ottoman attempts at suppression, this English effort failed because coffee houses had become too integral to society. Across the English Channel, France developed its own coffeehouse culture with distinct characteristics. The first French coffee house opened in Marseille, France's major Mediterranean port, in 1671. Marseille had extensive trade connections with the Ottoman Empire, so coffee arrived there naturally. But it was in Paris that coffee houses would become truly influential. The Café Prupe opened in 1686 by Francesco Prupio de Capultelli. A Sicilian became the most famous coffee house in Paris and perhaps in all of Europe. Located across from the Comédie Française Theatre, the Pro Coupe attracted writers, actors, philosophers, and intellectuals. Greater than. Unlike the simple English coffee houses, the Pro Coupe was elegant, decorated with mirrors and chandeliers, serving not just coffee, but also other beverages and food. It established the French café as a refined social space rather than merely a functional meeting place. The French philosophical movement, known as the Enlightenment, had deep connections to coffeehouse culture. Voltaire, one of the Enlightenment's greatest thinkers, was a legendary coffee drinker, reportedly consuming 40 to 50 cups daily. Though this number is likely exaggerated, he frequented the Prop and other Parisian cafes where he engaged in the debates that would produce his philosophical works. Denis Diderot, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and other philosophes similarly used cafes as gathering places where ideas could be tested, debated, and refined. The connection between coffee and the Enlightenment was not coincidental. The Enlightenment emphasized reason, empirical observation, and the free exchange of ideas. Coffee houses provided exactly the environment where such exchange could flourish. Unlike taverns where alcohol dulled minds, Coffee houses kept people alert and sharp. Unlike private salons, coffee houses were relatively open to anyone with the price of admission. Unlike churches or universities, coffee houses had no orthodoxy to enforce. You could say things in a coffee house that would get you in trouble elsewhere. By the beginning of the 18th century, Europe's appetite for coffee had created a serious problem. Demand was soaring. Coffee houses filled European cities, from London to Vienna. Merchants could sell every pound of coffee they could acquire, but all of it, every single bean, came from one source, Yemen. The Arabs still controlled coffee cultivation completely. They held a monopoly as valuable as any in world trade, and they defended it fiercely. The Yemeni authorities understood exactly what they possessed. Coffee plants did not grow wild outside the Arabian Peninsula and Ethiopia. To keep it that way, Yemen implemented strict controls. Coffee beans exported through the port of Mocha were treated in ways that prevented germination. They were partially roasted or boiled before shipment, ensuring that even if someone tried to plant them, nothing would grow. Guards watched the ports. Penalties for smuggling viable coffee plants or seeds were severe. For more than a century and a half, this system worked. Yemen remained the sole supplier of coffee to the world, and Yemen merchants grew rich from the monopoly. But monopolies create enormous incentives for those who can break them. European colonial powers, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, the English, all recognized that whoever could establish coffee plantations in their colonial territories would gain both strategic advantage and immense profit. Greater than. Consequences. The challenge was obtaining living coffee plants that could reproduce. This was not a matter of simply buying seeds. This required espionage, theft, and considerable risk. The Dutch made the first successful breach of the Arab monopoly. The Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials VOC, was the most powerful commercial organization in the world at the time, with a global network of trading posts, ships, and agents. The VOC had already established control over the spice trade in the East Indies, particularly in Java and other Indonesian islands. Greater than adding coffee to their portfolio made strategic sense. The exact details remain somewhat murky, but sometime in the late 1600s or very early 1700s, Dutch agents managed to obtain viable coffee plants from Yemen. Some accounts suggest bribery. Others mention deception or outright theft. What matters is the result. Living coffee plants reached Dutch hands. The VOCC transported these precious plants to their botanical gardens in Amsterdam, where they were carefully cultivated and studied. Once the Dutch had successfully grown coffee in Amsterdam, they began the process of transferring it to their tropical colonies. In 1706, the Dutch shipped coffee seedlings from Amsterdam to their colony on Java. The climate and soil of Java's highlands proved remarkably suitable for coffee cultivation. The plants thrived. Within a few years, Java was producing coffee commercially. By 1720, Javanese coffee was entering European markets, competing directly with Yemen coffee and breaking the Arab monopoly. The Dutch did not stop with Java. They established coffee plantations on Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, and other territories under their control. The VOC managed these plantations with the same ruthless efficiency they applied to all their colonial operations. Local populations were forced to grow coffee. Land was confiscated. Labor was coerced. The Dutch had transformed coffee from a relatively small scale crop grown by Yemen farmers into a colonial commodity produced through systems of exploitation and control. While the Dutch were industrializing coffee production in the East Indies, the French were plotting their own coffee coup. France had established colonies in the Caribbean, particularly on the islands of Martinique and Sandang, the western part of Hispaniola, which would later become Haiti. These colonies had rich volcanic soil and tropical climates perfect for valuable crops. The French had already grown wealthy from Caribbean sugar plantations. They wanted coffee as well. The problem was the same one the Dutch had faced: obtaining viable coffee plants. The Dutch guarded their Japanese coffee jealously, and the Arabs had tightened security after the Dutch theft. The French needed their own source. This is where one of coffee history's most famous adventures begins, involving a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clerc. Dilo was stationed in Martinique, but had returned to France on leave in 1723. While in Paris, he learned that coffee plants from the Amsterdam Botanical Gardens had been gifted to King Louis XV and were being cultivated in the Jardin des Plantes, the Royal Botanical Garden. Descours became obsessed with the idea of bringing coffee to Martinique. He believed coffee cultivation would make both his fortune and his reputation. Descours requested permission to take a coffee plant to Martinique. The authorities refused. Coffee plants were too valuable to simply give away, and de Clerc was not important enough to merit such a gift. But de Clerc was determined. According to his own later account, he enlisted the help of a lady of the court. Some versions say she was a royal physician's wife. Others suggest someone with even closer access to the king, who obtained a coffee seedling for him through charm or deception. In 1723, de Clerc boarded a ship bound for Martinique with his precious cargo, a single coffee plant in a glass case designed to protect it from salt spray and weather. What followed was a journey that would become legendary in coffee history. Though we must note that our only source for many details is de Clerc's own account written decades later, which may have been embellished. According to de Clerc, the voyage was harrowing. A fellow passenger, jealous of Delalier's potential success, allegedly tried to destroy the plant. Pirates attacked the ship. A massive storm nearly sank them. But the greatest threat was water shortage. When the ship's water supply ran low, drinking water was strictly rationed. De Clerc claimed he shared his own meager water ration with the coffee plant, keeping it alive at personal cost, while other passengers suffered from thirst. Whether every detail of this account is true, we cannot know. What is undeniable is that de Clerc did successfully transport a living coffee plant to Martinique, and that he did manage to cultivate it. He planted it on his estate and guarded it carefully. The plant flourished in Martinique's climate. It produced seeds. Delalier cultivated those seeds, producing more plants. Other French colonists recognized the opportunity and acquired seedlings from de Clerc's plantation. Within a few years, coffee was spreading across Martinique. From there, it moved to other French Caribbean colonies. By the 1730s, Sandang was receiving coffee plants. The rich volcanic soil and perfect growing conditions of that colony would soon make it the most productive coffee region in the world. The single plant that declared across the Atlantic became the ancestor of millions of coffee trees. Throughout the Caribbean and Central and South America, the significance of these coffee heists, the Dutch theft from Yemen and de Clerc's from France, cannot be overstated. They broke the Arab monopoly permanently and irreversibly. Yemen would never again dominate coffee production. Within decades, Caribbean and Indonesian coffee would dwarf Yemen output. The global coffee map had been redrawn, and the new map was defined by European colonial power once coffee plants took root in Dutch colonial soil. The Dutch East India Company moved quickly to transform coffee from an experiment into an industry. What happened in Java and Ceylon during the 18th century established a model of coffee production that prioritized profit above all else, extracting enormous wealth for the Netherlands while imposing devastating costs on the indigenous populations forced to grow it. The VOCC's approach to coffee cultivation in Java was systematic and ruthlessly efficient. The company did not own vast plantations worked by enslaved laborers as the French and British would do in the Caribbean. Instead, the Dutch implemented what they called the forced cultivation system, a method that made entire villages responsible for growing coffee as a form of taxation. Village leaders were required to ensure their communities planted specific quantities of coffee trees, tended them properly, and delivered the harvested coffee to Dutch collection points. This system appeared less brutal than outright slavery because Javanese farmers technically remained free people working their own land. But this freedom was largely illusory. Farmers had no choice about whether to grow coffee. They could not sell their coffee to anyone except the VOC. The prices the company paid were fixed far below market value, often barely enough to cover costs. Greater than. Farmers who failed to meet quotas faced punishment. Village leaders who could not compel their people to comply suffered consequences. The system was coercive exploitation dressed in the language of trade and taxation. The impact on Japanese agriculture was immediate and severe. Coffee requires specific conditions and considerable care. Trees take 3 to 4 years before they begin producing meaningful yields. During that time, farmers still needed to eat, but the land devoted to coffee could not grow rice, the staple food crop. Communities that had previously been self-sufficient in food production found themselves dependent on purchasing rice from elsewhere. Greater than. When coffee prices were low or harvests poor, famine threatened. The Dutch selected specific regions of Java for intensive coffee cultivation, particularly the highlands where elevation and climate favored the crop. The Priangan region in western Java became especially important. Here, the forced cultivation system reached its most extreme form. Entire mountainsides were cleared of native vegetation and planted with coffee. Traditional agricultural patterns developed over centuries to suit local conditions and community needs were discarded in favor of coffee. The coffee produced under this system flowed to VOCC warehouses, where it was processed, packed, and shipped to Europe. The company maintained strict control over every stage. Independent trade was forbidden. Japanese farmers could not improve their situations by growing better coffee or finding better buyers. They were locked into a system designed to benefit the VOC and its shareholders in Amsterdam, not the people doing the actual work of cultivation. By the middle of the 18th century, Java was producing massive quantities of coffee. The island's output eclipsed anything Yemen had ever achieved. Where Yemen coffee production had been measured in thousands of pounds annually, Java produced millions. The VOCC's ships carried this coffee to Amsterdam, where it was sold throughout Europe at substantial profit. The Netherlands grew wealthy from Japanese coffee, building grand houses, funding arts and sciences, and establishing itself as one of Europe's most prosperous nations. That prosperity was built on the backs of Javanese farmers who saw little benefit from their labor. The brand Java became synonymous with coffee itself. Europeans who ordered coffee in coffee houses were likely drinking Japanese beans. The word Java entered European languages as slang for coffee, a usage that persists in English today. This naming was a form of geographic eraser. Coffee had originated in Ethiopia and been cultivated first in Yemen, but Java's name became the global identifier. Dutch colonial power had rewritten coffee's identity. Ceylon, the island the British would later rename Sri Lanka, followed a similar pattern under Dutch control. The VOCC established coffee plantations there, beginning in the early 1700s. Shortly after their success in Java, greater than Ceylon's Central Highlands provided ideal conditions. Cool temperatures at elevation, rich soil, reliable rainfall. The Dutch implemented forced cultivation systems similar to those in Java, requiring local Sinhalese farmers to grow coffee for the company. Ceylon never matched Java's production scale, but it became an important secondary source for Dutch coffee. More significantly, the infrastructure the Dutch built, roads, warehouses, administrative systems, would later prove valuable when the Brit seized Ceylon during the Napoleonic Wars and expanded coffee cultivation even further in the 19th century. The human cost of the Dutch coffee system is difficult to quantify precisely because the VOC kept records focused on production and profit, not on the well-being of the people whose labor generated those profits. We know that life expectancy in coffee-growing regions was lower than in areas not subjected to forced cultivation. We know that famines occurred when coffee cultivation displaced food crops. We know that the social fabric of Japanese villages was strained by a system that turned neighbors into enforcers and made traditional leaders into agents of colonial control. The VOC justified this exploitation through the racist ideologies common to European colonialism. The Dutch convinced themselves that they were bringing civilization, order, and economic development to backward peoples. They argued that Japanese farmers were fortunate to participate in global trade, even though that participation was forced and offered them no meaningful benefit. They portrayed resistance to the system as laziness or ignorance, rather than the rational response to exploitation it actually was. Resistance did occur, though the VOC suppressed it effectively. Farmers who refused to plant coffee or who tried to sell their harvest independently faced punishment. Villages that failed to meet quotas had their leaders replaced with more compliant ones. The VOC maintained military forces throughout Java specifically to enforce the economic systems that kept coffee flowing. These were not large armies. The Dutch never had the population to occupy Indonesia with massive military forces. But they were effective enough, supported by local collaborators who benefited from the colonial system. The coffee plant that Gabriel declared across the Atlantic did not remain confined to his estate for long. By the 1730s, coffee cultivation was spreading rapidly across Martinique, as French colonists recognized the profit potential. But Martinique was small and French colonial ambitions were not. The island that would transform Caribbean coffee production and become the world's dominant supplier was Sandong, the western third of Hispaniola that France had claimed from Spain. Sandang possessed everything coffee needed to thrive. The colony's mountains created diverse microclimates at different elevations. Volcanic soil was extraordinarily fertile. Rainfall was abundant and well distributed through the growing season. Temperatures stayed warm year-round but cooled at higher altitudes, providing the temperature variation coffee plants preferred. In purely agricultural terms, Sandang was arguably the finest coffee-growing land in the world. Coffee arrived in Saint-Domingue in the 1733, brought from Martinique by French colonists who had observed its success there. The first plantations were established in the mountainous regions where conditions most closely matched those of Yemen and Java. The results exceeded expectations. Coffee trees grew vigorously. Yields were high. The quality was excellent. Within a decade, Sandang was exporting significant quantities of coffee to France. Within 2 decades, it had surpassed Mai. By the 1760s, Santone was producing more coffee than all other regions combined. This explosive growth was made possible by one thing: the enslavement of African people on a massive and horrific scale. The plantation system in Sandang was chat slavery in its most extreme form. Enslaved Africans were property bought and sold, worked to death, and replaced. They had no rights, no protections, no hope of freedom except through the vanishingly rare act of manumission by their owners. The system was designed for maximum profit extraction with no consideration for human welfare. The process of establishing a coffee plantation in Saint-Domingue followed a brutal pattern. A French colonist would acquire a land grant, usually in mountainous terrain. Enslaved laborers recently arrived from Africa or purchased from other colonies would be forced to clear the land, cutting down native forest, removing vegetation, creating terraces on steep slopes to prevent erosion. This work was backbreaking and dangerous. Men, women, and children wielded machetes and axes in tropical heat, clearing acres of dense forests to make way for coffee. Once cleared, the land was planted with coffee seedlings. This required care and precision. Each tree needed proper spacing, adequate shade from larger trees or artificial structures, and protection from wind. Enslaved workers planted thousands of trees under the supervision of overseers who enforced discipline through violence. A plantation might have 10,000, 20,000, even 50,000 coffee trees. The scale was industrial, even though the methods were manual. Coffee trees required 3 to 4 years before they produced meaningful harvests. During this period, plantations still needed labor but generated no income. Plantation owners often compensated by forcing enslaved workers to also grow food crops between the coffee trees or on less suitable land. Even then, Sandang became dependent on imported food because so much land was devoted to coffee rather than feeding the population. Once coffee trees began producing, greater than the harvest season dominated plantation life. Coffee cherries ripened unevenly, requiring multiple passes through the plantation to pick them at optimal ripeness. This meant months of intensive labor. Enslaved workers moved through the groves with baskets, selecting and picking the red cherries, carrying heavy loads back to processing areas. Children worked alongside adults. The elderly were not exempted. Pregnancy was not an excuse for reduced labor. Processing the coffee cherries after harvest was equally labor-intensive. The outer fruit had to be removed from the bean inside. Some plantations used the dry method, spreading cherries in the sun and turning them repeatedly until they dried, then hulling them to remove the dried fruit. Others used the wet method, pulping machines to remove the fruit, fermentation to break down remaining mucilage, washing to clean the beans, then drying. Both methods required constant attention and heavy work. Once processed, the coffee beans were sorted by quality, packed into barrels or sacks, and transported to the coast for export. Indeed, greater than roads in Sandang's mountains were poor, making transport difficult. Enslaved workers carried coffee on their backs or loaded it onto pack animals, navigating treacherous paths down to ports like Cap Franc, where ships waited to carry the coffee to France. Greater than. The mortality rate among enslaved people on Sandang's coffee plantations was staggering. Historians estimate that the average life expectancy after arrival in the colony was less than 10 years. This was not because coffee cultivation was inherently more dangerous than other crops, though it certainly was dangerous, but because plantation owners calculated that working enslaved people to death and buying replacements was more profitable than maintaining them long-term. The transatlantic slave trade provided a constant supply of new captives from Africa. Plantation owners could and did treat enslaved laborers as disposable. The scale of this horror is difficult to comprehend. By the 1780s, Santo had approximately 500,000 enslaved people, making it the Caribbean colony with the largest enslaved population. The majority worked on sugar plantations, but tens of thousands labored specifically on coffee estates. The colony was producing roughly half of the world's coffee, millions of pounds annually, and all of it was produced through this brutal system. The wealth this generated for France was immense. Stomang was the most profitable European colony in the world. Coffee was its second most valuable export after sugar. And in some years, coffee revenues actually exceeded sugar. This wealth flowed to French merchants, French plantation owners, and the French crown through taxes and trade monopolies. It funded the elegance of Paris, the French Navy, and French participation in European wars. The French economy in the late 18th century was substantially dependent on Caribbean slavery. Other Caribbean colonies established their own coffee industries during this period, though none matched Santong's output. Jamaica, under British control, developed significant coffee production, particularly in the Blue Mountain region, where altitude and climate created conditions for exceptionally high-quality beans. British planters used enslaved African labor on the same model as Sandang, though on a smaller scale. Cuba, still under Spanish control, began growing coffee in the 1748. Spanish colonists established plantations in Cuba's eastern mountains, again using enslaved labor. Puerto Rico and other Spanish Caribbean colonies followed similar patterns throughout the Caribbean. Coffee and slavery became inseparably linked. The economic logic of Caribbean coffee production rested entirely on slavery. Without the ability to force people to work without compensation, coffee could not be produced profitably at the prices European markets demanded. The margins were not enormous, even with free labor. Pay workers fair wages, provide decent conditions, and the economics collapsed. Slavery was not incidental to Caribbean coffee. It was the foundation. European consumers rarely confronted this reality directly. Coffee arrived in European ports as a finished product, cleaned and ready for roasting. The violence and suffering that produced it remained invisible, an ocean away. The same French intellectuals who gathered in Parisian cafes to discuss Enlightenment ideals drank coffee grown by people who experienced the opposite of enlightenment: darkness, brutality, and despair. Some voices spoke against slavery, including the trade in enslaved people and the plantation system. Quaker activists in Britain and America began organized opposition to slavery in the mid-18th century. Some French philosophers questioned the morality of forcing human beings into bondage. But these voices were marginal, easily ignored by those who profited from the system or simply enjoyed its products without thinking about their origins. The coffee trade also drove the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade itself. As coffee plantations multiplied and existing enslaved populations died at horrific rates, demand for new captives increased. Slave traders intensified their operations along the West African coast. More people were kidnapped, more villages raided, more families destroyed. The coffee growing in Caribbean mountains was directly linked to the suffering experienced in African coastal dungeons where enslaved people awaited ships that would carry them across the Middle Passage. Brazil in the early 18th century was a Portuguese colony known for gold mining, sugar production, and the extraction of Brazil wood that gave the colony its name. Coffee was not part of this equation. Truly, greater than, while the Caribbean and Java dominated global coffee production. Brazil remained a minor player in global agriculture, exporting raw materials to Europe, but not yet the coffee that would eventually define its economy and identity. Coffee arrived in Brazil in 1727, through another act of smuggling that rivals Gabriel de Clerc's famous journey. The protagonist this time was Francisco de Palta, a Brazilian military officer of Portuguese descent. The Portuguese government, observing the wealth that coffee had brought to French and Dutch colonies, wanted to establish coffee cultivation in Brazil. The problem was obtaining plants. The French and neighboring French, Guiana, guarded their coffee plantations as jealously as the Arabs had once guarded Yemen coffee. Petter was sent to French Guiana, officially to mediate a border dispute between French and Dutch colonial authorities. His real mission was to acquire coffee plants. The governor of French Guiana, not foolish, refused all requests to share coffee plants or seeds. But Petter, according to the story that became Brazilian legend, charmed the governor's wife, whether through romance, persuasion, or mere sympathy for his cause. She allegedly gave him a bouquet at a farewell banquet. Hidden within the flowers were coffee seedlings and seeds. Like the Caldi legend and much of Decla's story, the details of Petter's tale may be embellished. What matters historically is that he did successfully bring coffee plants to Brazil, and those plants found conditions even more favorable than the Caribbean islands or Japanese mountains. Initially, coffee cultivation in Brazil was limited to the northern region of Para, where Palheta planted his smuggled specimens. Coffee grew well there, but the region was distant from major population centers and ports. For decades, Brazilian coffee production remained minimal, a curiosity rather than a significant crop. The colonial economy continued to focus on sugar and gold. Coffee was something farmers experimented with, not something that drove economic development. The transformation began in the late 18th and early 19th centuries when coffee cultivation moved southward to the regions around Rio de Janeiro. The Paraíba River Valley, known as the Vale do Paraíba stretching between Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, would become the epicenter of Brazilian coffee and eventually world coffee production. The geography of this region was ideal in every way that mattered. The Vale do Riba had rich terra-red soil filled with decomposed volcanic rock and organic matter. This soil was extraordinarily fertile, perfect for coffee. The region had rolling hills and mountains that provided the cultivation coffee preferred, along with valleys that offered some variation in microclimate. Rainfall was abundant and well distributed. Temperatures stayed warm but not excessively hot. Native forest covered the region, which tragically for that forest meant land could be cleared and immediately planted without depleting soil fertility. Brazilian coffee production began expanding seriously after 1822, when Brazil gained independence from Portugal. The new Brazilian Empire, ruled by Emperor Pedro I, and later his son Pedro II, actively promoted coffee cultivation as a means of building national wealth. Greater than. Coffee became a patriotic enterprise, a way for Brazil to assert itself as a significant player in global commerce. The expansion was rapid and ruthless. Entrepreneurs, soon to be known as coffee barons, acquired vast tracts of land in the Vale do Riba and surrounding regions. They cleared the forest, old-growth Atlantic rainforest that had stood for millennia, fell to axes and fire. In its place came coffee trees planted in neat rows, stretching across hills as far as the eye could see. Individual fazendas, coffee estates, might encompass thousands of acres planted with hundreds of thousands of coffee trees. This agricultural transformation required massive labor, and Brazil provided that labor, the same way the Caribbean had through slavery. Brazil had the largest enslaved population in the Americas, with millions of Africans and their descendants held in bondage. As coffee expanded, the internal slave trade within Brazil intensified. Enslaved people were moved from declining sugar regions in the northeast to the coffee estates of the south. New captives continued arriving from Africa, until Brazil finally abolished the international slave trade in 1850, though slavery itself persisted until 1888. The conditions enslaved people faced on Brazilian coffee fazendas were comparable to those in the Caribbean: brutal, degrading, and often deadly. They cleared land, planted trees, tended groves, harvested cherries, and processed coffee. They did this under the constant threat and regular application of violence. Fazendeiros, the coffee estate owners, built their wealth on the labor of people they treated as property. The grand manor houses that still dot the Vale do Portugal, now tourist attractions, were built and maintained by enslaved workers. What distinguished Brazilian coffee production from the Caribbean was primarily scale and staying power. Where Caribbean plantations were relatively small operations on islands with limited land, Brazilian fazendas could expand almost indefinitely across a continental interior. A single Brazilian coffee estate might be larger than the entire coffee-growing region of a small Caribbean island. This scale allowed Brazil to increase production year after year. By the 1840s, Brazil was producing more coffee than any Caribbean colony. By the 1850s, Brazil was producing more than all other coffee-growing regions combined. The numbers were staggering. In 1850, Brazil exported roughly 130 million pounds of coffee. 10 years later, that figure had nearly doubled. Brazil had become the coffee superpower, a position it has never relinquished. Even today, Brazil produces roughly 1/3 of the world's coffee. The coffee boom transformed Brazilian society and economy fundamentally. Coffee became the country's primary export, its main source of foreign exchange, and the foundation of its economic growth. The coffee barons became Brazil's most powerful social class, wielding enormous political influence. Many served in parliament. Some became provincial presidents or imperial ministers. The emperor himself depended on coffee revenue to fund his government. Coffee wealth concentrated in specific regions and families. The Vale do Pará became Brazil's richest agricultural area. Cities like Vassouras and Valencia grew wealthy, serving the coffee trade. Rio de Janeiro, as the primary coffee export port, flourished. The money flowing through Rio funded infrastructure, cultural institutions, and urban development. Coffee made Brazil matter in ways gold and sugar never had, transforming it from a colonial backwater into a significant economic force. But this success carried the seeds of future problems. Brazilian coffee cultivation was extensive rather than intensive. Fazendeiros cleared new land constantly rather than maintaining soil fertility on existing plantations. The terra roxa was rich, but even it could be exhausted by decades of continuous coffee cultivation without proper soil management. Greater than, all this work greater than, as soil depleted in older regions like the Val do Pará. Coffee cultivation moved west into São Paulo province and eventually into the interior. greater than, greater than. This pattern would repeat. Clear forest, plant coffee, extract wealth, exhaust soil, abandon land, move on. The environmental impact was catastrophic. The Atlantic rainforest that once covered much of southeastern Brazil was systematically destroyed to make way for coffee. Biodiversity was eliminated. Watersheds were disrupted. Soil erosion became severe in deforested areas. The ecological cost of coffee's economic success was enormous, though few people at the time considered this a problem. Progress meant converting wilderness into productive farmland. That the wilderness had its own value was not a concept that influenced decisions. The dependence on coffee also made Brazil economically vulnerable. When coffee prices were high, Brazil prospered. When prices fell, the entire economy suffered. This boom and bust cycle would plague Brazil throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, creating wealth and poverty in alternating waves as coffee prices fluctuated on international markets. A society built on a single commodity was inherently unstable, but the profits during good years were too attractive to resist. America in the 18th century was a tea-drinking, kinking society. The British colonists who settled the Atlantic seaboard brought with them the habits and tastes of England. And in England, tea was the beverage of choice. Colonists gathered for tea in their homes. Taverns served tea. Tea was imported by the shipload from Britain, which controlled the tea trade from India and China. We must intervene. Coffee existed in the American colonies. Some colonists drank it, and coffee houses operated in major cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. But coffee was secondary, exotic, less woven into the fabric of daily life than tea. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 changed this cultural equation in ways that went far beyond its immediate political impact. The event itself is colonists angry about British taxation policies and the Tea Act that gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales. In the colonies boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This was not about the beverage itself. It was about taxation without representation, about colonial rights, about resistance to British authority. But symbols matter, and tea had become a symbol of British power and colonial subservience. To drink tea after the Boston Tea Party was to side with Britain. To reject tea was to declare oneself a patriot. As tensions escalated toward the Revolutionary War, rejecting tea became a political statement. American colonists who supported independence stopped drinking tea publicly. They needed an alternative, and coffee was available, accessible, and importantly not British. This shift was not immediate or complete. Many colonists continued drinking tea privately. Loyalists certainly continued. And in the early days of the Revolution, coffee supplies were uncertain because coffee came through Caribbean colonies controlled by European powers. But as the war progressed and American identity solidified, coffee increasingly replaced tea in American culture. By the time independence was won, coffee had become the American drink. What began as political necessity transformed into cultural preference. Americans developed a taste for coffee. The generation that came of age during and after the Revolution drank coffee as their default hot beverage. Tea retained some presence, particularly among the upper classes and in certain regions. But coffee dominated. Where England remained stubbornly devoted to tea, America became coffee country. This divergence in beverage preference marked a broader cultural separation. America was defining itself as distinct from Britain, and coffee versus tea became one of many ways that distinction manifested. The American embrace of coffee differed from European coffee culture in significant ways. European coffee houses had been centers of intellectual discourse, commerce, and social mixing. American coffee houses existed and served similar functions in cities like Philadelphia and New York. But the American coffee story was equally about home consumption and frontier life. Americans drank coffee at breakfast, brewed in their kitchens. They drank it throughout the day while working. Coffee became a domestic, everyday beverage in ways that had never quite happened in Europe. The American frontier was central to this coffee transformation. As settlers pushed westward across the Appalachian and eventually across the Mississippi, they took coffee with them. Cowboys, pioneers, prospectors, and settlers all relied on coffee. The image of coffee brewed over a campfire drunk from tin cups became iconic in American mythology. Why coffee rather than tea? Practical reasons played a role. Coffee traveled well. Coffee beans were less fragile than tea leaves, more compact, easier to store in saddlebags or wagon supplies. Coffee could be brewed strong and bitter without ruining it, while tea required more care to prepare properly. More than practicality, though, coffee suited the American self-image. Americans saw themselves as hard-working, practical, non-nonsense people building a nation through physical labor and determination. Coffee, strong, bitter, stimulating, fit that identity better than tea, which carried associations of British refinement and leisure. The American working man drank coffee. The entrepreneur drank coffee. The farmer, the craftsman, the soldier all drank coffee. It was democratic, classless, American. American coffee consumption increased dramatically throughout the early 19th century. Imports rose year by as the population grew and spread across the continent. By the 1820s, America was importing millions of pounds of coffee annually. By the 1840s, that figure had increased several times over. The United States was becoming the world's largest coffee market, a position it has held ever since. American demand drove much of the expansion of coffee production in Brazil and other Latin American countries. Thank you. The way Americans prepared and consumed coffee also began diverging from European practices. Americans preferred their coffee weaker than Europeans, but consumed it in larger quantities throughout the day. They added sugar liberally. American coffee was typically sweetened, while European coffee was often drunk black or with minimal sugar. Americans also began experimenting with coffee additives and variations. Coffee, the root of a European plant, was roasted and mixed with coffee to extend supplies or reduce costs, particularly in New Orleans, where French influence remained strong. This Coffee coffee became a Southern tradition. The development of American coffee culture happened alongside dramatic social and economic changes. The Industrial Revolution reached America in the early 1800s, bringing factory work, urbanization, and new social patterns. Factory workers drank coffee to stay alert during long shifts. And so, coffee's long and aromatic journey from the mountains of Ethiopia to the cups of the modern world comes to an end. In a single sip, my life has found meaning thanks to the power of thousands of years of intellectual heritage and social bonds. We have learned that coffee is not merely a beverage, but a fuel that drives the pace of thought in modern civilization. Take care of yourselves until our next journey.